This week I learned that All's Well That Ends Well is a play by William Shakespeare, published first in 1623. It's listed among the comedies. Have you read it? This was brand new to me. I didn't know that was true. I was familiar with that phrase, all's well that ends well, because my family has used it in certain situations for as long as I can remember. Sometimes when we make mistakes or things go wrong and we finally make our way through, we might say, all's well that ends well. And I find for me that these words can reassure and help us move forward no matter how difficult things may have been. Now, we have been through a lot as a community and a country over the last 20 months, and things haven't always ended well. And some things haven't finished. I don't know that we have ended some things. After all that we have faced together and continue to experience, I'm not sure that we may be able to say all's well that ends well. And yet, even if we aren't at the end of some realities in our life, it may be time to take a look again at the practices, the way that we spend our time, how we create patterns in our lives as we move together into the future. Our choices can make a positive difference both in our lives and in the lives of other people. And so as we move into whatever's next, we can decide to be faithful, to follow Jesus, and to do that together. Today we continue in our worship series, A Life That Matters. During this series, we're considering how we might live as followers of Jesus amid today's realities. Together, we're discovering ways to grow into a life that matters as individuals and as a community of faith. Last week, we began the series with the story of Job, who was a man who knew what it was like to have things go wrong in his life. We remember that God doesn't always act how we might expect. God doesn't look at the world the way that we might look at the world from our single perspective. God's vision is broader than our own, and God's love is far more profound than our own expectations. Today, we will again consider the reading from Job and the Gospel according to Mark to see if we can say all's well that ends well, or perhaps maybe Job could say that. Let's take a closer look at this story. The reading from Job brings us to what seems like a happy ending for him. It seems excellent because Job has had just a terrible time in his life. You remember that Job is a pretty good guy. The text tells us that he is righteous and he honors God. And while he seems to have his life put together, he is faced at the very beginning of this book with the destruction of his crops, his animals, the death of his children. He has lost nearly everything. If there's anyone that could use a happy ending, it's Job. And at last, we think, when we come to this reading for today, after all of this struggle, all of this pain, we can get on a big smile with Job and proclaim, well, yeah, all's well that ends well, can't we? It's not just a happy ending, it's a restoration. All that was lost is now returned and increased, multiplied. How can we not rejoice in this turn of events? And yet perhaps we should be careful about drawing this particular conclusion. Many biblical scholars warn against wrapping up the story of Job in a neat package with a bow on top. And while it may be tempting to find a straightforward resolution for Job, this may not be the most faithful response. For you remember that Job has profoundly wrestled with complex issues of suffering and faith. And the text invites us to that very same struggle. We can't just wave it away with a magic wand. We can't just wave away the past 20 months and pretend it hasn't happened. In Job 42, verses 3 and 4, Job seems to recount both sides of the conversation with God. I'll read these verses again from verse 3. You said, "Who is this darkening counsel without knowledge? I have indeed spoken about things I didn't understand, wonders beyond my comprehension." You said, talking about God, "Listen, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will inform me." Do you remember those words from last week? Who is this darkening counsel without knowledge? Do you remember? Those are God's words, and Job confesses that he spoke from a limited perspective. He was looking out for himself. And then he recounts God saying in response, "Listen, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will inform me." God says that Job will inform God. And as I mentioned last week, there's several ways that we could interpret those words, the tone or the mood, how those are shared. One interpretation is this specific directive when someone is trying to figure out what happened. Say there's an accident or an argument or a disagreement and you come on the scene. Sometimes this happens for me as a parent and I try to ask the questions, okay, listen, I need to get some answers here. What exactly was going on? Will you tell me what happened? Maybe you've had a conversation like that where you just need to get things straight. I know I have. And yet today I want to invite you to consider that perhaps there's another way of interpreting those words. It may be that Job is recounting his experience of God coming alongside him during his pain and struggle. Job is stumbling over his words and God says, just talk to me, Job. You've got questions. That's good. I've got some too. I'll listen to your words. I'll listen to your heart. I'll listen to your hurt. Tell me in this face-to-face moment, tell me what I already know, what I see in you. Speak to me, Job. Speak to me. Job may be recounting an experience with God that brought the restoration of his relationship with God before God restored Job's family and fortune. You see, Job's relationship with God has been tested, but it hasn't been broken. It needs care and attention to heal. And if this is the case for Job, I know it's been true for me over these months. There have been some times when I have had some frustrated and disgusted words for God because things aren't going the way that I think they should. Why, God? Why did this thing happen? Have you been in that place? Asking and questioning God. Maybe a distance in a relationship that wasn't there at other times. Sometimes, if we find ourselves there, we don't always stop to listen, to pause, or remember that God is actually interested in our lives, that God hears us and loves us in return, no matter what we offer God. And then sometimes there's a turn for the better. The text tells us that the Lord blessed Job's latter days more than his former ones, and Job dies old and satisfied. Of course, this reality doesn't mean that Job forgot his children that had died. Children born later in life don't erase the memory of the ones that had died earlier in life. And while filled with blessings, Job's days may have just as certainly been filled with memories and tears and the lingering effects of the trauma that he has suffered in his life. Yes, he's received things new, but no, it doesn't erase the memory of things that are gone. Job's eyes are opened when he has this encounter with God. He's experienced transformation with God at his side, sometimes in good times and other times in not so good times. But what is certain is that God is always with Job, and God is always with us. Because this is our life too, right? Sometimes we're ready for change in our lives and we're looking forward to it and we welcome it with open arms. And yet at other times, transformation occurs without my permission, without some recognition that, yeah, I think we should do things this way. And sometimes changes lead us into an uncertain future and we have to make our way step by step. Our community is different than it was 2 years ago. Our congregation is different than it was 2 years ago. It's changed dramatically, both in expected and in surprising ways. And in all of these transformations, God is ready to listen to what's on our heart. And God is with us, no matter what. God listens to Job, and in the gospel passage, to a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. You remember that the story from the Gospels is one of many stories where Jesus heals. This story of healing begins with Jesus listening. Jesus and his disciples are on the way out of town. They are headed to another destination. There's a huge crowd and a particular blind beggar by the side of the road. Bartimaeus is his name, and he hears that Jesus is walking by and begins to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." And even though many in the crowd tried to keep him quiet, Jesus listened. In the midst of all the noise, Jesus listened to one person's cry. Jesus stopped what he was doing and invited him to come forward. And when the blind man stands in front of Jesus, he asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus listens, stops, and asks a question to listen again. And the blind man said, "Teacher, I want to see." And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." And at once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. And what happened to Bartimaeus, and sometimes happens to us, is that our eyes can be opened. This man was blind, and now he can see. He can see the world in ways that he literally could not before. Job had an encounter with God that opened his eyes to a broader perspective than in the before times. And over the last 20 months, we have seen things differently. Sometimes we've been forced to, sometimes we have chose to. I see myself, my family, and our congregation in different ways today than I did several years ago. As a community, we see more clearly political and racial and socioeconomic divisions and tensions that are a reality among us. We can see the world as the mess that it is sometimes, even as we also see the glimmers of God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. Open our eyes that we might see. The good news is that God is listening. God is listening to you. God listens especially to those who are suffering. God opens our eyes so that we can see the truth about ourselves and the truth about the world. So I invite you to listen to what God might be speaking to you today. This week, experiment with looking at your neighbors the way that God sees them as dearly loved children. And if you find yourself suffering like Job, or in need of vision like Bartimaeus, remember, God listens to you. We can ask God, "Open my eyes and help me see what's true." And remember that no matter what you're experiencing, no matter what we have been through together, that in the end, God's love wins over all. The worst things that we can imagine in our lives are never the last thing. All will be well, because with God, all ends well. Will you pray with me? Oh God, we wait for you quietly. We are ready to see. We want to see your will done in our lives, so we ask, open our eyes. Shine your light into us, so that out of us we will share your light in dark places and your love to everyone we meet. In Jesus' name, amen.